My name is Gonzalo Iturregui-Gallardo and I am a PhD student within the NEA project. I've been doing research on audio subtitling and most particularly we've been testing the emotional arousal in blind and partially sighted participants. In order to measure the emotional arousal, we use EDA and heart rate, which are psychophysiological measures, but we also used a self-report instrument, which is called the SAM questionnaire. So the SAM questionnaire is quite used when measuring emotional arousal, since it's very easy and quick to complete, and it's also very simple. The problem is that it uses graphical representation of faces, so we had to adapt these graphic representations for those people who cannot see or have low vision. In order to do that, we did a focus group with 5 people. Before doing a focus group, we had to propose different haptic adaptations of the questionnaire. And this was based on some of the few guidelines existing in the literature. So there's not a lot of literature written on how to adapt forms into haptic representations. So we took into consideration the following aspects. First of all, the elimination of redundant objects, simplification of the forms, leaving enough space from one object to the other, then the reduction to 2D forms instead of using 3D forms, then using references based on real experience, so not the whole representation of the object, but what can be understood. So, for example, from a tree, we can use a leaf, which is something you understand as a whole. And finally, the use of consistency throughout the whole product. The second issue was the material to be used. Since molds are very expensive, we had to come up with some idea that allowed for a more economical and affordable way of doing this questionnaire. So we issued 2 different variables of this questionnaire by hand, and then we adapted that, we digitalized, we vectorized all the lines in order to come up with a PNG format file. And then we printed it using UV gloss, which is actually a type of resin that is quite cheap and it's quite available in normal copy shops. We basically repeated the printing for 7 times in order to achieve some relief. With these 2 versions of the SAM questionnaire, which we will call the T-SAM questionnaire or Tactile SAM questionnaire, we ran our focus group with 5 participants who were blind or partially sighted. The questions in the focus group were divided according to the 2 dimensions or the 2 scales of the questionnaire. And then also we asked some questions about the whole understanding of the T-SAM questionnaire. And the results were quite, I would say, fruitful, and we managed to get a lot of feedback from the participants. The responses were different according to the type of sight loss our participants had. So people who were blind from birth, for example, had more difficulty understanding the shapes and the features of a human face. Those who had seen in the past and who were also young, so they were very familiar with emoticons or the representation, the fake representation of faces in the form of emoticons, could understand perfectly the progression of the faces. And for those who were completely blind, they actually said that maybe only with a numerical scale that was enough. And actually the T-SAM had a braille representation of the numbers, so that was very useful, and with some help they could understand also the faces and also the representation of the forms. This is the final result, so this is the final T-SAM questionnaire, And in the first scale, the difficulty was found in the understanding of the faces and the progression from a sad face to a very happy face. And in the second scale, we wanted to portray the activation of the emotion of the participants, so from a more relaxed state to a more activated or aroused state. So faces and forms. And actually faces were difficult to understand for those participants who were completely blind, but they also had the support of the numerical scale. Participants who were partially sighted asked for augmented numbers that were introduced afterwards. And for the second scale, the form, since it is an abstract representation of the arousal, it was understood by all participants the same way. Only those participants who were completely relying on the touch, they needed a little bit more of explanation, but eventually they all had the same understanding of the questionnaire. And actually we managed to create a questionnaire who was going to use by blind and by also sighted participants. So actually it's an inclusive questionnaire for everyone. Results were very interesting since blind and partially sighted participants and sighted participants achieved the same results. So actually they all benefited from this simplification and haptic adaptation of the questionnaire. That shows that actually it is possible to create instruments that can assess emotional arousal in participants with different needs.
Transmedia Catalonia is a research group funded by Secretaria d'Universitats i Recerca del Departament d'Empresa i Coneixement de la Generalitat de Catalunya under the SAGR funding scheme, reference code 2017 SAGR 113. The project NEA, New Approaches to Accessibility, has received funding from the Ministerio de Economía y Competitividad under the Excelencia scheme with reference code FFI 2015-64038B, Mineco FEDER UE. This video is made available to you under the Creative Commons license.